Greetings, folks. Sealer here. This is well, I've lost count now how many times I've tried to do the commentary for this video, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the IFHE changes that were introduced in 092 and offer you my opinion and perspective on taking this skill. And frankly, the original text I wrote for this, frankly, was too long and complicated, and I'll try to get to my main answers quite quickly and offer a couple of exception points for you to consider, but otherwise try to make this as succinct of a level of feedback as I can regarding this skill. The match in the background is myself in the premium tier 7 Soviet cruiser, the Lazo, and this is a tier 9 domination match on Sea of Fortune. I'm in a division with Len Wilkie, who is in the premium tier 7 Soviet destroyer, the Leningrad. I'm not going to do any commentary on the replay itself, although this match is kind of indicative of some of the changes that have taken place with IFHE and in 092. So to kind of cut to the chase, if you are sort of still thinking about whether you take IFHE and on which ships, etc., the most succinct answer I can give you is that with a few exceptions, which I'll touch on in a moment, the light cruisers and gunboat destroyers, where you had previously taken IFHE, you should continue to do so. Yes, there is a reduced fire chance. Yes, with some of the armor thickness changes, there are some places where previous shell characteristics allowed penetration prior to 092 with IFHE, now no longer allow it. But by and large, you will want to continue to take IFHE on light cruisers and gunboat destroyers. So let me get a little more specifics just so that I'm clear as far as my feedback here. So for the Atlanta and Flint, which are light cruisers that carry the U.S. Navy 127 millimeter guns, you will want to take IFHE. You will penetrate up to 26 millimeters. This will allow you to be effective against mid-tier battleships, but you will no longer be able to penetrate 27 millimeters, which are present on some of the upper-tier U.S. Navy and German cruisers. Yes, you will want to continue to take IFHE on your non-German light cruisers with HE at 152 millimeters, 155 millimeters, all the way up to 180 millimeters. So this includes things like the U.S. Navy light cruisers, the Soviet light cruisers, the French, the Japanese, and including the Soviet light cruisers or sort of semi-heavy cruisers, the Kirov. The Kirov you probably can get away with not having it, but the Molotov for sure, and the Dmitry Donskoy for sure, you are going to want to have IFHE on. You will not want to take IFHE on heavy cruisers with calibers above 200 millimeters and above, with a couple of consideration points again, which I'll touch on here in a moment. So the German cruisers, let me get this one out of the way. Don't need to take IFHE. They didn't need to take it prior to 092. They still don't need to. In fact, they got kind of buffed out of the 092 changes because now Wargaming, the way that it calculates and rounds the penetration levels of the HE shells, they actually, you penetrate up to and equal to the ratio, and they actually round up. So the 150 millimeter shells from the Königsberg and the Nuremberg can penetrate up to 38 millimeters, which is the deck thickness on upper tier U.S. Navy battleships, as an example. And there's a couple other places where you see 38 millimeters armor. So the Germans actually get a buff out of this. I will talk about secondaries because that's in a moment, because that also is a place where the Germans got some buffs out of these changes. But for main battery guns, again, take them on 127s for your light cruisers, on your light cruisers between 152 and 180 millimeters. You should also take, in my opinion, IFHE on mid-tier and upper-tier Soviet gunboat destroyers. So these are with 130 millimeter guns, as well as the French destroyers with 139 millimeter guns, and the upper tier Japanese gunboat destroyers, the Kitakaze, the Akizuki, and the Haragumo with 100 millimeter guns. So you will want to continue to take IFHE for those ships. Certainly starting at tier 7 and higher, you may even want to consider for tier 6. Okay, so couple of exception areas to consider with regard to main guns. Do not take IFHE on the tier 9 and tier 10 Royal Navy destroyers, Jutland and Daring. That was required prior to 092 because the 113 millimeter guns could only penetrate up to 18 millimeters, which was not enough to even get through most destroyer surfaces at those tiers, or even superstructures on ships. Now, thanks again to the rounding rules, the 113 millimeter guns will penetrate 19 millimeters without IFHE. And if you take IFHE on those ships, you are wasting the skill points because it increases the penetration to 24 millimeters. Excuse me. And there are no surfaces above 19 millimeters and below, above 19 millimeters and up to 24 millimeters. So it's a complete waste now to take IFHE on those two destroyers. So don't bother taking it at all. Be glad that you can take those 4 points and apply them to somewhere else. The other two consideration points with regard to IFHE on cruisers are with the Henri, which had with the 240 millimeter guns with IFHE could penetrate up to 50 millimeters. That was very popular for a lot of competitive builds to be able to combat like Stalingrads and some battleships, GKs and Yamatos and so on. And that benefit still exists from a penetration perspective, but because of the 50% reduction in fire chance from IFHE, I think that is too steep of an impact on the Henri to consider continuing taking that. So I would not recommend IFHE anymore on the Henri. The other cruiser consideration is that on some of the German heavy cruisers, especially the Hindenburg, some players used to take IFHE in order to allow those guns to penetrate 60 millimeters, allowing them to penetrate surfaces on the Sovietsky Soyuz and the Kremlin, the tier 9 and tier 10 Soviet battleships. Here again, that benefit still exists after these changes. However, with the steep fire reduction chance, I would not take it on those ships anymore. That would just be my recommendation. So for the Henri and for the Hindenburg, I would not recommend IFHE for those ships if you had been taking them previously. Okay, so that's main battery considerations. For secondaries, the two main areas are going to be the U.S. Navy and the Germans. So for the U.S. Navy, the 127 millimeter secondaries will now only with IFHE will now only penetrate up to 26 millimeters. They will no longer penetrate 27 millimeters. This means that those guns, those secondaries, will not be able to penetrate a number of surfaces on a lot of heavy cruisers, especially the U.S. Navy and German cruisers at the upper tiers. They will allow you to penetrate bows and sterns of mid-tier battleships still, and most cruisers at the upper tiers, which tend to have 25 millimeter surfaces. So it's a choice that each individual player needs to make, whether they're willing to put the investment into those 4 skill points to get that additional alpha potential against those types of targets. So that's a choice to be made for U.S. Navy battleship secondary build captains. Now for the Germans, this change in 092 actually represents a buff for the German secondaries. So the 128 millimeter secondaries present on the Gneisenau and the Große Kurfürst now penetrate 32 millimeters out of the box without IFHE. There is no need, in my opinion, and I think general opinion, that you use IFHE for the 128 millimeter guns anymore. So for your GK builds, I don't know too many people in the Gneisenau that took IFHE, but if you did take IFHE for your Gneisenau, I wouldn't bother doing it, and certainly not for your GK. Again, put those 4 points into other skills: fire prevention, basics of survivability, preventative maintenance, etc. Other things I would recommend putting into endurance or survivability skills. The only other place where you may want to still consider taking IFHE on secondaries is for the German 105 millimeter guns, which exist on the Scharnhorst, the Bismarck, the Tirpitz, and the Friedrich der Große. A lot of their secondaries are 105 millimeters. They will penetrate 26 millimeters out of the box without IFHE. With IFHE, they can penetrate up to 32 millimeters after 092. So again, a decision point for players to make that play those ships a lot. I tend not to take IFHE on my German secondary builds at all. The only exception I have is on my Friedrich der Große. It's a little bit of a novelty build, so that if I do want to play that style, I have a captain to use, but otherwise I don't put IFHE on my other German secondary builds. So that is kind of the most succinct way I can describe my recommendation. There is a very good article by Little White Mouse that has been put up on the World of Warships forums, and I'll leave a link to that article in the description below. She goes into a lot of this. Well, actually, she goes into a little more detail. She breaks things down by class, by tier, by gun caliber, and her recommendations are more or less in line with what I've described. I disagree with her on a couple of points, especially she is not consistent in her recommendations around taking IFHE on French and Soviet gunboat destroyers. And I generally recommend taking them starting at tier 7 or higher. She's kind of a mixed in terms of her recommendations there. So that's one place where her recommendations and mine deviate a little bit. But that's also a very good resource and again, I'll leave a link to that article in the description below. And then finally, please do check out, if you haven't already, the details of the IFHE and armor thickness changes that have been implemented in 092 on the World of Warships website under the 092 announcement article. Again, I'll leave a link to the description. I'll leave a link to that article, in the description below. That goes into a lot of the details around the facts of what have changed. There's not much in the way of discussion as far as what they recommend. In fact, Wargaming has pointed players to look at Little White Mouse's recommendations as sort of a guide. But the article that Wargaming published for 092 at least goes into the facts about what specifically has changed, and players should generally look at that. So with that sort of fairly unstructured level of feedback, hopefully you got the basic message, which is in most cases where you were taking IFHE, you should continue to do so. At least that's my recommendation. And then there are a few exceptions, like I said, with the Jutland, the Daring, the Only, the Hindenburg, and Secondaries, where you may have still a consideration point to make around those builds. So I hope you found the information here useful. Please do leave your comments below, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I do read all comments, and I'll answer the questions to the best that I can. And with that, we hope to see you out there on the virtual seas, and we wish you happy sailing.